So I've been asked to describe how we went from thinking about a biblical social paradigm that we've been thinking about in the 1970s and 80s through to the language of public policy that we included in the R Factor, which was published in 1993, and the work that then followed on in the Relationships Foundation and so on. So just how did that take place? I'll tell you the story. This is a very personal story. It's what happened to me in that period. So it came about like this. In 1991, I decided that it was time to try and write up the idea of looking at public policy through a relational lens, or in terms of relationships. I'd only gradually come to that conclusion through the 1980s as one issue after another that I tackled: the Keep Sunday Special campaign, consumer credit and debt, and how to keep people out of debt, the work in South Africa with peace building. All of those areas I realized were to do with relationships. So I'd become confident by the early 1990s that you could deal with public policy in terms of relationships. So I got hold of someone I'd written several books with already, a writer called David Lee, who I had great confidence in, not just for his ability to express the message, but also for his ability to think through the issues. And I said to David, what about collaborating with me to write this book to say how you can look at public life, public policy from a relationships point of view? And he said he'd love to do that. So he was living up in St Andrews, and I used to go up to St Andrews, and we'd go around all the coffee shops together and enjoy ourselves, and we'd brainstorm about what this book was going to say. The book was ultimately called The R Factor. We weren't very long into this when David, who's, as I say, a very rigorous thinker, said to me, I've got a problem. And my problem is this. When we're talking about relationships, we need some categories, some language to describe what's going on in relationships. And the kind of language that I get from my Christian understanding is all very personal. So we talk about compassion and kindness, talk about integrity, faithfulness, mercy, loyalty, all kinds of words like that, but they don't fit with public policy. You can't talk about a government bill in terms of integrity and mercy and generosity. It's just not the language. I need some more ways of describing what's going on in terms of relationships. When we discuss economic policy, for example, what's the language? So we were stuck on that for a while, went around and saw some more coffee shops one by one and debated it. And then I had a brilliant idea, at least I thought it was brilliant. My brilliant idea was, Jesus himself says, love God and love your neighbor. On these two laws hangs all the law and the prophets. So that means that the ban on interest in the Old Testament, or the Jubilee laws on land, for example, must be about relationships. So what kind of relationships was God trying to set up by putting in place the Jubilee laws on land, or the ban on interest? So why don't we start from that point? And so we did. So we started off looking at the Jubilee laws on land and said, well, imagine that the Jubilee law was operating. What kind of relationships would you have in families and communities if the Jubilee law was operational? Well, the Jubilee law said that every 50 years, the land should revert back to its original family owners. So if they'd sold it, or rather leased it, during the last 50 years, it would go back into their possession. And everybody was meant to return to their traditional family land for a great celebration in the Jubilee year. So in a sense, they'd have roots. Their roots would always belong to that particular place. And we realized that that would impact on relationships in a very specific way. It would mean that people had very long-term relationships with people in a community. And so we realized that one aspect of the relationships that public policy creates or destroys is continuity in the relationships. So we grasped the first of our 5 main, what we now call drivers of building close relationships. Then we thought, well, how else would it affect relationships? And again, we realized that if people had this link to a community and perhaps lived in that community over a very long period of time, they would have a tremendous knowledge of all the background that a person had, what their interests were, what they were good at school, if they had schools in those days, what kind of particular skills they had, what motivated them, what their passion was, all those kinds of things. They have seen people operate in a whole range of situations. They'd have seen them on the battlefield, they'd have seen them in the agricultural harvesting operations, they'd have seen them celebrating at weddings, all kinds of situations, and they'd have a very broad view of them. And so we hit on the concept of what we now call multiplexity, many-sidedness in the relationship, a very broad knowledge of the other person. So that was a second realization, that public policy impacts on how widely people's knowledge is of one another. And the broader that knowledge is, the deeper the relationship tends to be, and the easier it is for people to be able to trust each other. So then we also realized that if people were in a community for a long time, communication would be primarily face-to-face. And of course, in those days, back in the Old Testament, probably most communication was face-to-face. But you always, even in those days, you had the possibility of sending a message through a third party rather than dealing with people face-to-face. But we realized that directness of communication was a very strong biblical theme. People don't necessarily meet God face-to-face, but certainly they have direct contact with God. They're able to pray directly to God, and God deals directly with individuals. I mean, think of Moses at the burning bush, for example, or think of the way that different people like Abraham in the Old Testament have a sort of direct communication with God. They're not going through third parties, they're communicating directly with God. And so gradually each of these 5 areas, directness and continuity and multiplexity, and then the idea of parity, again seeing the fairness with which the land was distributed, so every family had some land, that led us into the concept of parity. And then commonality, which is about shared goals and shared values, which was, again, the purpose of Old Testament law, giving the people of Israel a shared point of reference, a shared set of values and goals. All of these things were contributing to building relationships. After that, after we'd built that into the R factor, it's all in chapter 3, in a rather short space of time, but it's become an absolutely invaluable way of categorizing relationships. A couple more steps came later on, which were important. The first was the realization that you can describe relationships from lots of different points of view, rather like you can take a painting and describe it in terms of the colors or the style of the painter, or the kinds of ways that figures are described, or the amount of sky there is, or whether it's in oil or watercolor, whatever. Different ways of describing painting. In the same way, you can describe a relationship from many different points of view. And the key idea that underlies these 5 areas and unites them in a sense is the idea of relational distance. How close or how distant are people in their relationships? And again, we found, as we reflected on all that the Bible says about relationships, how that is a theme that runs right through the whole Bible. Obviously, when God sends Christ down to earth, a part of the Trinity, he is creating much greater relational proximity with humankind than there ever had been before. And we know from many passages that sin creates distance between God and humanity. And the whole purpose of the cross is to reduce that relational distance and, if you like, bring God and man close together. So relational distance turned out to be the big overarching concept. And what we were interested in was how you increase relational proximity. The other key concept that came through was that each of these 5 areas that we'd analysed, directness, continuity, multiplexity, parity and commonality, referred to a zone within which relationships took place. So those 5 zones are, for directness, the zone is communication. For continuity, it is time or story. For multiplexity, the zone is information or knowledge. Parity is in the zone of power or influence. And commonality is in the zone of goals and values. And so we found that all relationships, both personal relationships and relationships between organizations, simultaneously take place in these 5 zones. And therefore one can analyze or categorize what's going on in relationships in terms of the 5 zones. So the point of this language was partly that it gave us a way of describing relationships which was immediately accessible to any person really, and something that they could use in their daily lives very easily. But the other point about it was that it all had its roots back into Christian reflection. So we were bridging the gap between, on the one hand, the Christian teaching and values that underpin what we want to take into public life, and finding a language with which to communicate those values to people who might not be Christian at all. And that becomes very important because in so many situations in the world today, Christians are not given access to schools or hospitals or prisons. They're not able to go in and simply preach a Christian message. What they are able to do is go in and teach a worldview which has come out of biblical and Christian ideas and teaching. That is allowed if they have the language to do it with. And this provides that language bridge to make that possible.